Dear colleagues, welcome. We have a very interesting event today. We are honored to have with us Professor Barry BUZAN, who is a famous scholar from London. I spent about half an hour to read his curriculum vitae, and so I'm sure that you already you have seen his name on various volumes, articles, papers, whatever. I think it is very important that he accepted our invitation to participate in a debate on a very old-fashioned subject. We try to see if in a unipolar world, as it seemed to be after the end of the Cold War, there is a place for a multilateral approach and for global organizations. In a time when we see a lot of fragmentation, a lot of regional organizations having their own life, well, it's very strange. For instance, we had a meeting, a debate this morning about the European Union. And it's very strange that the European Union rejected, didn't want to sign, to ratify, to be part of the European Convention on Human Rights. There is, of course, an overlapping in international affairs, in international conventions, but it's clear that there is a tendency of reshaping some of the formats, some of the institutions that we lived with for a long time. But in this framework, we have at the beginning the presentation of Professor BUZAN on the rising powers in the emerging world order. So I'm sure that you are also interested to learn about the model of this emerging world order and about the powers who are rising in this framework. I'm sure that you would prefer to listen to Professor BUZAN instead of having my comments, but let's start our debate right now with the presentation of the lecture of Professor BUZAN, and then in the second part we'll have a panel with several colleagues, and we'll continue the discussion on the topic that I already mentioned. So Professor BUZAN, you have the floor.
Can you hear me if I don't use the mic, if I speak like this?
Okay. You better use it.
Unfortunately, the camera doesn't pick up you as well as with the microphone.
You need the mic. All right. I may have to. I don't have three hands here, so I may need to shuffle things about. Okay. I'm going to talk for about half an hour. If I'm talking too fast, stop me, slow me down. I'm going to talk partly about rising powers, an old-fashioned topic, as you said. But I'm also going to talk about what those rising powers are rising into. In other words, what the emerging world order looks like and why it looks like that. And to try and put these two things together to produce a more general kind of picture of where international society as a whole may be heading. So I'm going to talk by rising powers. I'm going to focus mainly on India and China, although much of what I say could also apply to Brazil. I'm not going to talk about Russia at all because I don't think of it as a rising power. And if you disagree with that, we can talk about that in the Q&A.
Great.
I think China and India are interesting to focus on because they are both very big. They represent old civilizations and are very conscious of doing that. They have a strong potential interaction with each other as well as with the rest of the international system. And in some ways they are quite similar. And I think the striking thing about them, and I'm going to return to this theme again and again, is that they are not just making a claim to be recognized as having the status and privileges of great powers, but they are also at the same time hanging on to their status as developing countries. And that's a rather novel combination, not something we've really had in the system before. And so part of what I'm going to say about how the system is emerging leads into that peculiar position of having countries that are both great powers and developing countries. Because I think you need to understand that mixture in order to anticipate how these countries are going to behave. Let me then say a little bit about the system as a whole. This work comes out of a book that George Lawson and I published a couple of years ago on the global transformation. The basic argument in that book was that everything of importance to international relations changed in the 19th century. That there were multiple revolutions of modernity, industrial revolutions, political revolutions, economic revolutions, technological revolutions, even psychological revolutions. That our sense of who we are, how we identified ourselves, how we organized politically, and the technological environment in which we lived were all completely transformed during the 19th century. And that transformation laid down the basic pattern of international relations in which we have been living ever since. But it laid it down in a peculiar way. It meant that a small handful of countries, mostly Western countries and Japan, acquired these revolutions of modernity very quickly, very early on, and they became tremendously powerful in relation to everybody else. And that was the point at which the distinction between developed countries and developing countries opened up. And for the last couple of centuries, we have lived in that world in which it was perfectly normal for a small number of countries to dominate the whole of the international system. They organized it for their own purposes and their own advantages. They created a world economy. They created a kind of global form of world politics. That, to my mind, is now coming to an end. So we're in a period of transition. We're transitioning towards what will probably be called the post-Western era until its particular character becomes clearer. This era will have, and is already beginning to manifest itself as having several features. I think that one feature is that it will have no superpowers. The United States is ceasing to be a superpower. It still is, but it's fading. And if you think about superpowers, at the end of the Second World War we had 3, and then rather quickly we had 2, and then after 1989 we had 1, and it seems to me that fairly soon we won't have any. And that will make a rather novel world compared to the one we've been living in for the last 2 centuries. It will be a world in which there are no superpowers. By superpower, I mean a country for whom the world is its region. But it will have quite a lot of great powers, countries like Russia and China and India and the EU and the US, which will be influential in several regions. It will also have a lot of regional powers that are mainly influential in their own regions. This world will therefore be marked by a considerable diffusion of power. Power will be much more widespread. The nice phrase from Florin about the rise of the rest basically means that those revolutions of modernity which got going in the 19th century and which were rather narrowly concentrated in a small group of countries are being acquired by more and more states and people. as they acquire those revolutions, they acquire the wealth and power that go along with them. So power and wealth are becoming more diffuse, and so also is cultural authority. And we have lived in a world in which, to oversimplify somewhat, a liberal teleology has become the dominant way of thinking. In other words, the rather American assumption that the world will all become like America. Star Trek world, if you like, to think of it in those terms. That somehow there was a teleology built into modernity that meant that everybody would have to become liberal and democratic and multicultural and American. That seems now to be breaking down. The Chinese are basically saying, no, we do everything with Chinese characteristics, including capitalism. It's capitalism with Chinese characteristics, and that means it doesn't go along with democracy. So the project of the Chinese Communist Party is capitalism without democracy, and they want to prove that this can be done. So this world will not only have a diffusion of wealth and power, but it will also have a diffusion of cultural authority. So old cultures like India and like China will reassert their cultural autonomy. The liberal West will no longer be able to project the liberal teleology as the way in which the world is necessarily going to unfold. And any of you who are enthusiasts for that liberal project are going to live in a disappointing world. This liberal project will remain strong in some places, but it will no longer be able to maintain the universal pretensions that it has. The good news is that although there will be cultural diversity and the spread of wealth and power, there's also quite a strong a strengthening, if you will, of the basic rules of international society. So this is a bit kind of technical international relations stuff, but my view of international relations is that we have a society of states, and like any society, this has rules, or it has institutions. So one of its obvious institutions is sovereignty, another one is democracy, sorry, not democracy, nationalism, and it has a variety of others, territoriality, international law, diplomacy, the idea that all humans are equal. These are ideas that are very widely shared, and they are shared amongst pretty much the whole of the existing community of states. We used to fight about whether the market, global capitalism, should be an institution as well. And for much of the 20th century, the argument was capitalism or not. But now that argument is gone. So there's more agreement about how we organize the political economy, because basically, if you want to answer the question, who won the Cold War, capitalism won the Cold War. Liberalism did not, communism did not, democracy did not, capitalism did. So we're all capitalists now, different kinds of capitalists, but that makes for much more closeness about the rules of the game than has been the case before. And that's because as various new societies acquire the revolutions of modernity, they acquire the set of rules, in a sense, that goes along with that. So it doesn't require cultural homogenization, but there has been some strengthening of the basic set of institutions that define international society. The other thing which I think is worthwhile contemplating here is that this emerging post-Western, if you will, international society is still in the grip of a strong globalization. And I think the way to understand this is that all of the members of this society are embedded in a set of shared fates. Or you might think of them as shared threats, if you prefer that. Most obviously, they are all entangled in the global capitalist economy. So one of the great contributions that the United States made was that the capitalism that it promoted was global capitalism. And even the Chinese, remember Xi Jinping's speech to Davos, even the Chinese buy the idea that capitalism has to be global. if capitalism is global, everybody has a vested interest in maintaining degrees of world trade and the institutions that govern world trade and finance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a strong shared fate there. If the world economy goes belly up, everybody is in trouble. So the Americans successfully sold that version of capitalism as opposed to an imperial preference capitalism that was predominant before the Second World War. Arguably, this emerging society will be more regionalized, but the fact that it, because there will be no superpowers and the great powers will tend to be the center of different regional orders, some of them more hegemonic, some of them more consensual. So we're looking not necessarily at a dissolving of the global level of international society, but certainly a dissolving of the liberal vision of that. So it could be thought that those who have been calling for a multipolar world, and many have been, that they are going to get their wish. But that world is not going to look like what they thought it's going to look like. I mean, one of the interesting features of all of those who've been calling for a multipolar world is that they haven't ever specified what they think that world is supposed to look like. So by calling for a multipolar world, they've basically been saying, we don't like American domination. And that's the beginning and the end of it. Quite what is supposed to replace American domination, nobody has said very much about it. Moscow hasn't said much about it, Beijing hasn't said much about it, and certainly New Delhi has not said much about it. So it seems to me that this word multipolar, like unipolar and bipolar, has presented a very oversimplified idea of a world order. And what we're going to get is going to be more complicated than that. It's not going to be a simple kind of multipolarity. And this is a somewhat technical international relations issue, but I'm happy to elaborate on that in the Q&A if you wish. Let me turn then to India and China a bit against this background. Obviously, one of the things that stands out about these two countries is that they are very big and very populous. So one of the things that this means is that demography is back in international relations. The era when the revolutions of modernity, by being concentrated in a small number of countries, enabled a country like mine, a relatively small place, to dominate a quarter of the world and to occupy India and beat up China at the same time and not even break sweat while doing so. The idea that that should be thought of as normal is very bizarre when you begin to think about the power and balance that represented. So for a time, the revolutions of modernity, because they weren't spread globally, eliminated demography as a major factor in power. But now demography is coming back, and India and China and their rise is typical of that. It's important also to think about who remembers and who forgets what, because who remembers and who forgets what is a very important driver of a lot of the dynamics of global international society. So India and China remember extremely well the humiliations of colonization and the period of Western power. The Chinese will bang on endlessly about the century of humiliation, and they reproduce that in their films and in their propaganda. They take this extremely seriously, and the Indians have not forgotten the humiliations and colonization either. And these countries are now becoming powerful. On the other hand, the West has entirely forgotten about colonization. We don't think about it at all. We think, well, we had a bit of a civilizing mission, and we had our day out there, and then we forgot about it. But this disjuncture between who's remembering what and who's forgotten what is going to become more and more politically important, because the West is going to be continuously reminded, more so than it has been, that it didn't play a beautiful role in many parts of the world, and those parts of the world are now becoming powerful. So there's a kind of post-colonial nationalism with a lot of historical chips on its shoulder that's going to be in play in this new world. So the counterbalance to this kind of diffusion of power and the importance of historical differences is going to be the fact that we're all embedded in shared fates. We're all embedded in the same global economy. We're all embedded in the same global environment, which has a variety of issues from climate change to global diseases. We're all affected in the same way by problems arising from the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, up to a point. Terrorism is something that also faces everybody. So there's a strong set of shared fate issues which need to be dealt with. And the question is, how is order to be provided in this emerging environment, where on one hand you've got a decentering in some ways, and on the other hand you've got forces of globalization that are requiring collective management. This makes important the point I made that this emerging world will have no superpowers. We've got used to the idea that superpowers should run the show. Superpowers run the show because the world is their region and they have global interests. Great powers don't operate in a strong way globally, so there's going to be less of a concern for the world order as a whole in a system which has only great powers in it. So how global governance is to be organized in this system is one of the big questions. Now, a particular concern that I want to put on the table is that I'm projecting a kind of multipolar system, although I don't like that label. It has several great powers. The problem is that for quite different reasons, these great powers are going to be autistic. By autistic, I mean that their behavior will be mainly driven by what goes on inside them, rather than driven by the logic of interaction between them. That's what autism more or less would mean in a human being. Now, states are autistic by definition. Everybody knows that domestic politics carries more weight than foreign politics in terms of who wins elections and what's considered important, or at least that's the case most of the time. But I think the particular circumstances in which we're moving are that the selection of great powers we're going to have is going to be particularly autistic. We can see already quite clearly that the old set of great powers, by which I would mean Japan and the European Union and the US, they no longer have the will, and increasingly they don't have the capability to run the world and to take responsibilities for things. That is a very clear way of understanding the election of Trump. It's a very clear way of understanding the vote for Brexit. We don't want to do this job anymore. It's expensive, nobody likes you for it, you don't get any thank yous, and we've been doing it for a long time. Enough. The electorates won't support this anymore, and we've got other things we want to do. So the old group of great powers is no longer willing and no longer has either the political or the moral authority to carry on with global leadership. The rising powers, however, and this is where the point I made about the fact that these rising powers are both claimants to great power status, but also strong claimants to developing country status. They don't want to take responsibility for this either. If you look at the rhetoric that comes out of New Delhi and Beijing, it's surprisingly similar. To paraphrase it, they would say, we are big countries, we have old civilizations, we deserve respect, we deserve great power status, we are rising in our wealth and power, but we are still developing countries. Our main responsibility is to develop ourselves, and that's going to be our principal contribution. If China develops itself, then it has raised a fifth of the world's population up from an agrarian, poor form of life up into industrial modernity. And the Chinese have been doing a good job of that, and India is beginning to do the same. But they're saying, that's all we're going to do. You can't ask us to do more because we're still developing countries. So these countries, too, are going to be autistic, only for a different reason. And I suspect that if you think that a country like Brazil is going to make it into the great power ranks, the argument would be much the same there as well. We need to develop ourselves first, So that's what we're taking as our main responsibility. The problem here, therefore, is that the world of autistic great powers will underperform in the management of collective global problems. And this, it seems to me, is one of the big political issues that we're going to face. Now, I can talk quite a lot, and I'm happy to go into the Q&A about the similarities, the differences between China and India, and about the rivalry between them. Amongst the similarities they have is that neither China nor India has a particularly coherent foreign policy making apparatus. India's foreign ministry is quite high quality, but it's smaller than that of Singapore. The Chinese foreign ministry doesn't count for anything in the hierarchy of power in China. It has poor links to the Communist Party, and it is unable to coordinate Chinese foreign policy. So if you look at something like the South China Sea disputes or the disputes with Japan over the Senkaku Islands, here you find foreign policy in China being made by all kinds of different agencies. The Navy is doing something, the Coast Guard is doing something, the Fisheries Ministry is doing things, the provincial governments are doing things, the state-owned industries are doing things. There's no coordination of this. And this is very odd for a communist country. You would think one thing a communist country would do is have central control over its foreign policy. But in China, this is not the case. So both of these rising powers still have quite severe institutional problems about their own foreign policy management. I think both of them are also, well, let me be blunt, they have no idea at all about what they want. China and India are extremely clear what they don't want. They don't want the continuation of Western dominance, and particularly American dominance. But what do they plan to replace this with? Big silence. There's nothing of interest being said in either China or India about this. Both of them seem to want a kind of regional primacy, the Chinese in particular. But whether this is going to be a consensual primacy or a coercive, more hegemonic one is much less clear. The Chinese might be developing a kind of grand continentalist strategy, the One Belt, One Road policy, trying to integrate the infrastructure and trade of Eurasia in a continental way as a counterbalance to what the Chinese see in a rather geopolitical or geoeconomic fashion as being a Western maritime strategy, that the West has controlled the world from the sea, and the Chinese having more of a land power position might be looking to control it more from the land. Okay, now I'm running out of time so that we go into close. It seems to me that both India and China have interesting choices. They have interesting choices in relation to each other, but also how do they play their own game within Asia. But they also have interesting choices about how they align with what is still the one remaining superpower. And they're making opposite choices about that. So India is leaning more towards alignment with the United States. I use the word alignment, not alliance. And China is leaning more and more away from that. It seems, therefore, that India is probably going to try to bandwagon with the other countries around China, with Japan, with Australia, and in a sense more distantly with the US, as a kind of hedging strategy in case of rising China turns a bit nasty, which is a possibility. But this means that there are interesting synergies and connections between, as it were, the Asia regional level, where the local countries have to decide whether to balance against China or bandwagon with it, and they actually don't want to do either. They want to maintain a kind of hedged position in the middle. Whether they will be able to that and succeed in keeping the US in the region is one of the interesting questions that will dominate the future of the international system. There is, of course, the possibility, if my autistic hypothesis has force, that China and India as rising powers will repeat the mistake made by the United States after the First World War, which is to say, they will not take their share of responsibility for global management. And we all know what happened when the United States failed to take its proper role as a great power after the First World War. The system was undermanaged and produced the Second World War. I'm not predicting a Third World War out of this, but the system, undermanagement would then become the chronic problem. I think the best hope of all of this is that one might look towards something that I would call a concert of capitalist powers. I'm calling it that because I think the capitalist element and the shared interest that gives is important. I'm perfectly aware that the Chinese will never join anything that's called the concert of capitalist powers, even though they are a capitalist power, and you're not in any doubt about that if you spend 5 minutes in Shanghai, that you're in a capitalist country. It's apparent on every street corner. But something like that, and I'm using an explicit analogy with the Council of Europe, which was likewise a group of ideologically disparate countries, but with a certain shared view of problems that needed to be managed. In this case, the problems that need to be managed would be those shared fate problems that I mentioned, which are mainly functional problems. And there are some grounds for optimism about this, and I'll end on this note. I think the principal ground for optimism is if you look at what happened with climate change over the last 15 or 20 years. That climate change was for a while very controversial. It split the West and the rest, and it split the West and China, because nobody could agree on who had responsibility for what, and therefore who should be taking the burdens of doing something about this. And yet in Paris in 2015, everybody came together and agreed the kind of formula that said, okay, we all agree this is a problem, and we all agree that we need to be doing something about it. You may well argue that they didn't do enough about it, but that's not the same thing. They actually agreed this is a shared collective problem, and we need to deal with it. And one of the reasons they were able to do that is because climate change is not an ideological issue. It doesn't make any difference whether you're democratic or authoritarian, or whether you're left or right or whatever. It's a functional problem. It needs to be dealt with no matter what your ideology is. So it didn't kind of run into the difficulties like democracy and human rights have done of being, in a sense, a liberal, kind of liberal standard of civilization imposition on the rest. So that, it seems to me, creates at least a flicker of optimism for the idea that perhaps even this rather autistic group of great powers might be able to get together sufficient amount of global management to deal at least with some of the shared fate problems that are going to be on the agenda. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor. Very interesting. Yes, I understood that the United States will be downgraded very soon from the level of superpower to the level of great power. And each of the great powers will have its own regional influence. The Americans will go back to the Monroe Doctrine, the America to the Americans. Then the Chinese and the Indians will have Asia. What about Europe? It will be a Russian area. So it is very, very interesting also to think about another possible scenario, in which we'll have three superpowers playing, two of them against the third one. A kind of a poker game, United States, Russia, and China, trying to get together, two of them, against the third one. And if you look a little bit at the context, the games, positions, whatever, you can see that there is, well, a certain trend for the Chinese and Russians coming closer, the Americans trying to improve their relations with China. It is clear that, well, the Russians until very recently had an excellent relationship with at least a part of the American establishment. So, well, it seems that we have three elephants which are playing in the courtyard. And of course, we in Romania and in some other countries, we are concerned that, well, the grass will suffer. So this is our problem when looking to prospects of a new model for the world order. I think it is very interesting to try to understand the trends existing, especially in Asia. We are not so used to follow the developments in India and also in China to some extent. So it was, for me at least, but I'm sure for my colleagues as well, a very interesting presentation. So now, if you accept, if there are some questions or some comments, perhaps, and then you will decide to make comments or to answer some of them.
Can I answer yours first?
Yes, please do.
I'll be brief, but just to set the ground here. In terms of regions, yes, of course, Europe would be one of the regions. I would be totally dumbfounded if Europe became part of Russia. I don't see. I mean, I know that Russia may loom large when you're sitting in Romania, but from a global perspective, I don't think Russia is. I said at the beginning, I don't think Russia is a rising power. It's a recovering power. It's never going to be. It's never going to be. Nobody is going to be a superpower. Yeah? I'll come to that in a minute. Russia has done well to stop dropping all the way down to being a regional power. Right? So it's still hanging on to a great power status, and will probably be able to do that. The EU will also hang on as a great power status in an odd sort of way. Not the normal kind of great power, but I think it counts. Regions will be very varied. Some of them, like the EU, will be consensuals, and like South America also. Some of them will be hegemonic. China looks bent on that in its part, and maybe Russia also has hegemonic tendencies in its part of the world. But I want to really challenge your idea of a three superpower world. What does it take to be a superpower? It takes something like having 40% of the global GDP, having a really interesting kind of universalist ideology of some sort that you can sell abroad, and having an interesting culture which is attractive to those around them. Now, nobody is going to get to that ever again. Superpowers, to my mind, were a particular phenomenon of that odd period when the revolutions of modernity were concentrated in a small number of places, and it was actually possible for countries like Britain and the US to get to having 40% of the global GDP. But that one country with 5% of the world's population should have 40% of its wealth is just not normal. So we're leaving those times behind. The Chinese are doing very well. They may end up being the second or even the first biggest of the great powers, but they're not going to be a globally dominant superpower. They do not have an ideology to sell, and they're not going to have the resources to do this. They may well dominate in Asia, but they're not going to dominate in the way that Britain and the US and up to a point the Soviet Union did. I think of the Soviet Union as a kind of half superpower, because it never had the economic heft, but it had the ideology and it certainly had the military heft. So where we are going to part company here is that I think the interesting part of this emerging world order is that it doesn't have superpowers, and that you need to understand that. Because a world which has only great powers in it is going to work in a very different way from a superpower world, because nobody is going to have such strong global interests. And you can see the way in which the US is losing its global interests now. And Trump is busily burning up such social capital as America has left. So not only are the Americans themselves losing interest in doing this job, but nobody else wants them to do it either. And there's more resistance to that kind of thing.
And I don't want to be more provocative, but I was wondering about the spheres of influence of great powers, for instance. And it is clear that the model of the 19th century, when the superpower was using its culture, its civilization, in order to legitimate its presence abroad, well, it's over. Well, I don't think that the Chinese would like to impose their culture well, elsewhere, but it is clear that they are more pragmatic than it used to be, let's say, Great Britain in the 19th century. There is another way of getting instruments of power, of getting control, well, perhaps this will not happen, and I hope so. So my short answer would be to your comments and to your conclusion, inshallah. So
okay. We know what our differences are. Let's see what other people think.
Exactly. Okay. Well, who wants? Yes.
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, the President and the Prime Minister, Professor Fundația Europeană, my name. I'm now retired general and advisor international relations. I would like to have your opinion. My feeling, if we take the three great powers, Russia, we know that still economically will be very weak. It's a great raw material country, huge country with a big possibilities, but unfortunately, they are still underdeveloped economically. And if we take into account Petersburg, Moscow, they are top, but the deep country is still underdeveloped. China is getting now better and better economically. And my feeling now, I would like to hear your impression, I'm thinking maybe America, who is losing now economic power, my idea, I would like to have your opinion, will try to compensate by the fact to have new weapons. They want to go further, to have the maximum highest technology, military technology, to compensate the loss of economic power and buy more sophisticated weapons. And it seems that a lot of weapons that we don't know, very hidden, then on which America are putting all his power to have this supremacy by military. It means either if China is getting more and more power, most of the economy in America is now on the Chinese hands. Really. Is my question, do you think that really, it's my feeling, that we are thinking now of the trend of America to compensate by new weapons, by new technology. Then finally, what will be most important, we have sophisticated weapons, we are dominating the world. Thank you.
Would you like to comment on that? Yes.
So one by one, we'll take three.
It's up to you. Who wants to ask questions or to make comments, please? Yes. Yeah.
So, Professor, if I understood correctly, your vision about the future of the world order is that we are looking at what district you said, rising powers. So can you please describe us a little what about their competition in defining their interests and projecting power, and how would they define their power? I don't know if my question is quite clear. How would they, for instance, compete? In what terms? For influencing the rest of the world, or at least the Asian countries? Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments?
Okay, let's deal with those two.
Yep.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, I'd agree that Russia has not yet got capitalism in a deep way like the Chinese have, and therefore, until the Russians figure that out, they're not going to be amongst the rising powers, in the sense that they're not generating a broad, deep, modern economy. As you say, they're still mainly a resource exporter. So until the Russians can find a solution to that problem, then I think you're right. I agree that China is likely to get stronger, although I don't see this in any kind of linear, they're going to keep on with 17% growth every year forever, because China is becoming a middle income country. The natural thing that happens then is that growth slows down. It has to become more internally generated with the consumer market and everything. So China has some very big internal adjustments to go through. As the Chinese themselves fear, they will get old before they get rich. They're going to pay a price for the one-child policy, because the shape of their population pyramid is very strange. I mean, they don't have quite the same problem that Russia and Japan do, but they're disappearing. But the Chinese population is going to look very odd for quite some time as a consequence of this. I think if the United States was stupid enough to do what you were thinking they are going to do, then they will simply end up like the Soviet Union, a kind of militarily top-heavy country with an ever-weakening economy that is unsustainable. So it's possible that they would do that, but I think it would be ruinous on them to do that. Now, whether you like or don't like the United States, the one thing you have to, I think, admire about it is that historically, at least, it has been an incredibly flexible society. That's both admirable and in some ways quite disgusting if you don't like inequality and all of the things that go on in the US. But it has been remarkably flexible. And I think that quality is not yet dead in the United States, so I think it would be very dangerous to write off the Americans. They are capable of remaking themselves, they have done so before, and their society is particularly well set up to do that. It's a pretty ruthless place. And therefore, that's why, in some ways, it's been as creative as it has in the technological and industrial terms. So I wouldn't write them off in the way that I don't think they're doomed to an economic decline. We're not talking here a Roman Empire scenario where the Americans are disappearing from the scene, right? And the same is true of Europe. All of the old powers are remaining powers. They're remaining big centers of wealth and power and civilization. So they're not disappearing. So the rising powers are rising to a situation in which strong powers are still there, and in which other strong powers are also rising, which is why my scenario of no superpowers. So what you say could happen, but I'd be a bit surprised if it did, and I don't think it's a strategy that is sustainable. And I think the fate of the Soviet Union proved that that kind of unbalanced military power, where the economy is weak and the military is too big, you can't sustain that. On your question, I agree, it is a slightly vague question. I will do my best to answer it. How are these powers going to, or how are these regions and powers going to compete with each other? Well, the clearest answer is that the global system of capitalism is a competitive system. Everybody is out there competing for markets, competing for economic advantage, et cetera. And that element isn't going away. If anything, it will get stronger. Will there be a kind of old-fashioned spheres of influence competition where people are trying to carve out empires? Maybe to some extent. We were talking on the drive down here about Russia, whether Russia should be thought of as having a kind of empire-like mindset. But then the question is, what is actually the proper territory of Russia? So is it only interested in filling in up to a certain point, or does it have an open-ended expansionist program in mind? I don't know the answer to that. China, it seems, is looking for a kind of primacy in Asia, but if Chinese tradition is anything to go by, that will not involve the Chinese colonizing or domineering over their neighbors in a military way, but simply wanting the neighbors to kowtow, to be respectful, to acknowledge China's primacy in the region. Whether they do that or not, I don't know. But for the rest of it, I think because the commitment to capitalism is to global capitalism, the main feature of competition is going to be in that area. It's not that you're not going to have a replay of the Congress of Berlin and the carving up of Africa amongst the rival powers. They will all be playing, in that sense, the global market deterritorializes this kind of competition. And it seems to me that that's likely to be the main structure of that competition.
Please, first let me have a small comment and perhaps also a question to add at the number of the questions which have been raised. Professor, European Union is, or it will be a great power? It seems to be an autistic power anyway, very much concerned with its own situation and having a very limited role outside its own region. And what about Great Britain? Great Britain, what will be the international status of Great Britain after Brexit? So these were my two questions, and now your question is.
I would like to start by thanking you for your presentation. I have actually two questions. The first question pertains to the nature of the new order you are discussing. Because inasmuch as you've told us that functional issues, non-ideological issues, are of a concern to the future or to all the great powers, the question is, what are the characteristics that define a new order? Because if there aren't any new issues on the table, then we're managing the older issues. To my mind, the difference, the qualitative or quantitative difference that you've emphasized is that there's going to be fewer interventions, and that the interventions we've had so far in this unilateral world order, or in this old world order influenced by unilateralism, were interventions taken in terms of responsibility, and in the future we're going to have lesser or fewer of them because nobody's going to take up the responsibility. But I'm asking you, fewer interventions undertaken in a multilateral setting won't open a possibility for an increased institutionalization of the new world order. My second question is, do you think that to the extent that the world powers are going to become autistic, because you've argued that they're going to be focusing more on issues of domestic policy, do you think that isn't this a reason, isn't this a consequence of the fact that some forms of liberalism have become embedded in the domestic order of these societies? I mean, not even, for example, the leadership of China can claim that they are ruling a society regardless of what the Chinese people think about them. These are my two questions. Thank you.
Okay. Is the European Union a great power? I mean, I count it as one, but I know that this gets into nerdy IR debates, because if you're a proper kind of neo-realist, you think that a great power has to be a state. Some sort of the EU is clearly not a state, so it's a sort of a peculiar beast. It seems to me that the EU has sufficient actor quality, if I can call it that, even though it's not a state, to act as a great power. It's a major center of wealth and power and cultural influence. It doesn't have much in the way of a foreign and security policy, although it does in the economic sphere. But it is a very discernible center of gravity, to use that analogy. And so I think as long as you can clearly identify it as a center of gravity in that way, it counts as a great power and will continue to do so. And it's influential in a number of regions, although I would agree its basic tendency is perhaps also to be rather autistic in the sense that it has enough trouble keeping its own show on the road, and it has to negotiate everything internally, which is problematic. So I agree with that. How long have we got? Do you want me to discuss Great Britain? I mean, all I can do is put my cards on the table. I was a strong Remainer. I think Brexit is an enormous infliction of self-harm. I think it will take the country off the map for the next 15 years. Its internal politics are shambles. It's totally divided about this and hasn't a clue. And I do mean it hasn't a clue what to do. It's only just beginning to realize how big a disaster this is, in the sense that hundreds of arrangements which affect the operation of everything from airlines to nuclear power plants have to be renegotiated. And they have to be renegotiated from a position of weakness. So we're going to spend 15 years of wasted time renegotiating a bunch of agreements that we already had and doing so from a weaker position. The best outcome is that we will be quite a bit worse off. The worst outcome is that we will be a lot worse off. There are a number of complete fantasists operating in the British politics at the moment who think somehow that the British Empire or the Commonwealth is going to rally round and that Britain will become a world power again. It's just not going to happen. So my only compensation of this is that I am sufficiently ancient myself that I will be dead before this works itself out. And I think I can survive well enough myself. But the rest of it is just a very depressing disaster. In terms of your two questions, when you say what is the new order, right? Well, the label I'm going to give it is post-Western, because it seems to me the key thing is that we are ending a period in which that small group of mainly, but not entirely, Western countries, because Japan was part of them from the beginning, not often recognized, but that small group of countries is losing the centrality of its control and its cultural dominance, its economic dominance and power. It's had a huge influence on history and has shaped the future in many ways. But its era of direct domination is now over. That for me is the main thing, because it's the working out of a process that began in the middle of the 19th century when this huge power gap opened up between the small group of countries and everybody else. So the big thing that's happening is that power gap is closing now, and we need then to work out how this world goes forward. The structural features of it are, as I tried to point out, that there's a diffusion of wealth and power, and there's a diffusion of cultural authority, which means that the dethroning of the Western liberal teleology is part of this picture. Probably because its power and wealth and cultural authority are more diffuse, this will be a more regionalized world. I can say that with some confidence, but don't ask me to spell out exactly what each region is going to look like, because there are just too many variables in play. I mean, as you can see, who would have expected that the EU would have suffered the loss of one of its major members? That's a kind of black swan event, and such events are continuously turning up. So it seems to me those are the main features of it, and I see from your use of vocabulary that you are an IR person and have read John Rundy and all of that. So I can give you a technical answer as well. The label for this system would be deep pluralism. Deep pluralism simply says that wealth and power are widely distributed, and that cultural authority is also multi-centered. The good scenario, if it comes about, would be that this deep pluralism would become embedded in the sense that all of the players within it would understand and accept that that was the system that they were in. So an embedded deep pluralism in this sense would imply that there was a conscious acceptance of difference, a respect for it, not just tolerance, but actually respect for it, and the understanding that we're in a world in which different cultures are going to unfold their modernity in somewhat different ways, and some of them are going to do it in an authoritarian way, and some of them are going to do it in a democratic way. I know I'm sounding like the Chinese propaganda department, but they haven't paid me to say this. It's actually what I think is going to happen. That would be the best we can hope for, because if there was an understanding that that's the world you're in, and a respect, an acknowledgement for that, then that would provide the basis for the functional cooperation I was talking about, and make it easier. If everybody is still trying to say, oh, you know, the world is only going to unfold according to one teleology and it's ours, then you're in a more conflictual world where cooperation is more difficult. So there's plenty to play for in this world. I think the diffusion of wealth and power and cultural authority is happening whether you like it or not. How you deal with it, however, there's a lot of room to play and to make policy and to make knowledge arguments on that basis. Yeah, I think that covers what I was.
Any other questions or comments? No, it's okay because we can move to the second part of our debate then. And allow me then to invite our colleagues to join us. Mr. Florin, pentru, who is a professor with the University of Craiova. Mr. Igor Istomin, a professor and researcher at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. Mr. Cristian Nitoiu, who is a professor with London School of Economics, and Mr. Florin, Secretary General of our foundation, we know him perhaps better than all the others. But now, dear colleagues, if each of you will speak for about 1 hour, then we'll have a very pleasant time this evening. If you decide not to speak more than 10 minutes, we'll have time also for Q&A. And Professor BUZAN and myself will try to moderate and to make comments, eventually to participate in a debate about, once again, a subject which is in a way connected with what we have discussed so far. Is multilateralism still an option for states, or do they look only to their neighborhood, regional alliances, security alliances? Is the UN a dead body or still living? Well, is the Security Council the model for the next institution in Europe? A kind of concert des nations, a kind of monitoring and decision-making body. Well, I'm sure that in Romania, where we used to speak a lot about United Nations, in the last years, very few debates took place on that, because we have been concentrated more on European Union, on regional organization, and we have left outside our interest the global organization. Well, of course, the UN became less efficient, having being split in one body which is based on principles of international law, on the fiction that all the states are equal, and each state has one vote. And on the other side, you have a second chamber, the real chamber for decision, with 15 members, in which 5 of them have a veto, and they can decide or block or whatever. So the idea of reforming the UN has a long history already, but it's very difficult to move there, because once that you open the Pandora box, you have the Germans trying to get in, the Japanese trying to get in, and well, it is not very easy to take a decision on that. So the UN remain in a kind of intensive therapy chamber, with, well, from time to time dealing with the secondary conflicts of international affairs in the General Assembly. And having all the time, well, at a certain moment after the end of the Cold War, the great powers, the superpowers at that time, and also the great powers, accepted that intervention and occupation of foreign territory is out of the rules of the game. It was the case of the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. And at that time, well, the permanent members accepted that they have to do something about it. But after some time, well, the life in the Security Council became more difficult, and the interest became obvious in the sense that each of the members of the Security Council blocked the other one when trying to move on the table. So I think it is a very interesting discussion about the mission of the United Nations, trying to solve international security issues, or attempting to do that. Let's see what our colleagues will tell us about that. Who will start? It's up to you to decide. The order?
I can go ahead. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Please.
After you, sir. Thank you so much. That's the second privilege I get to share the panel here with you. Thank you for that. Now, I would like just to pick up on some of your latest comments, because that may open up a bit of discussion also amongst ourselves. And there are a couple of fallacies of any potential theory that we could look at when we speak of multilateralism. And I'll get back to that in my talk, just to relate that to your latest comments. Because it seems to me that we have narrowed the discussion on multilateralism exclusively to the UN. And I strongly believe that there is a bit of variations when we would need to speak about multilateralism. Now, I'd like to get back to this. A second commentary I'd like to raise is related to states as being, according to the international law, equal subjects. And it seems to me that this is a bit of legally mechanical, forced approximation on what we do in real politics, not in real politics, but in real politics, in global politics on a daily basis, when we give roles, when we ascribe status, when we entitle status to states, because it seems to me that even in the discourse nowadays, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, we still like to make a recourse to the terms coined such as developed countries, developing countries, emerging power, great power, superpowers, etc. So we've got this kind of inequality that there's no novelty down now. It has been institutionalized already for decades. And if you look at the UN, let's pick up this example. It goes back to the very core structure of the UN, that the inequality that you would easily find within the P5 of the UN, the hierarchy of states, the inequality in terms of their presence and their contribution to the global governance within the global village, it is already there. And apart from that, there's a second aspect that we may want to take into account to further make commentary, and this is the functional differentiations that states have been asked to contribute. You name it, starting from ensuring global capital, delivering services, maintaining security. Not every single state is able to deliver according to a particular expectations. So I would be a bit cautious on how we would be playing with that. It hasn't been very fashionable downtown, this concept with multilateralism, particularly because we in the Western Hemisphere have been very good at torpedoing it recently. And I'll just pick up, because the new administration of the White House gives us a lot of factuality to play in within the IR world, right? So if you just look at the latest malign statements that the latest guy at the White House has produced, you don't need any commentary on that. He has declared even before coming in office that he would conclude any Paris Accord that is a blatant mistake on behalf of the US that any administration has ever signed. And apparently he did that. He promised to dismantle any trade agreement that would look like TTIP, PPT, whatever you call it. And apparently he did that already, right? If we could go even a couple of years before that, when, to my knowledge, it was the US torpedoing the World Trade Organization as the very multilateral organization to secure a fair trade regime, right? When they came up with this idea of macro-regional trade agreements. So I think we've been very good at this recently. And you may pick up any regime, any international regime that has been literally dismantled, not just during the Cold War, but I would very much underline particularly after the end of the Cold War, with the very rising of the unilateralism and with the very rising of the exceptionalism, let's call it, of the Western Hemisphere, not just of the US. So we can validate this already. Pick up the Doha round, right? So it is there, bits and pieces that we could put together to give us a particular genuine description of that. But let me get back to the fallacy of any potential theory that we could produce when we discuss in terms of multilateralism. The first couple of them just mentioned, focusing exclusively on the UN. Second one would be associating multilateralism exclusively with the emergence of formal international organizations, and particularly with the intergovernmental ones. And I think that has been limiting a lot our capacity in terms of innovating forms, variations of global governance. A third one would be giving it a scale associated exclusively with the global level. Particularly whenever we wanted to use it as a paradigm to analyze factuality on the ground, and I'll get back to this. Limiting the outcomes of multilateralism almost exclusively to the global commons, and taking that as a one-size-fits-all, as it would need to meet all the expectations, ignoring the regional ones. And there's a lot of discussion we had in the car with Barry. I'll just use your comments in the car a bit later on to get back to this one. It has been defined as a cooperation among 3 or more states. But why limiting that to states? Another one would be taking multilateralism as an end in itself, developing multilateralism as an instrument of the weak states. That used to be quite the classical definition of multilateralism, to promote alternative agendas, or even as the invisible hand of the great powers to advance their own agenda, or, as I said earlier, as the weapon of the weak states. My personal take now, so won't be any novelty when we discuss on multilateralism. Point number one that I would very much like to raise and get your feedback on is that we need to look at it as a construct, as a multi-layered construct, and to give it a very much of a regional level approach. And I'm so glad my colleague brought that up earlier, because there could be, and they're already in the pipeline, variations of multilateralism So you could pick up any region, you could spin off the globe, you could take a region, and you could identify at least a minimum one variation of multilateralism. So Russia, for instance, would be happy to give its own definition to multilateralism, and it's doing that, but successfully to some extent, but it's doing that, right? In the Middle East, is there any multilateralism? Well, you may debate on that, but they may have a bit of form of multilateralism, right? More than 3 countries cooperating, if we take the old definition. My second point would be we need to look cautiously at the contribution of the non-state actors, and that was brought a bit earlier. So to what extent the non-state actors, and you may name them, may have any potential, may produce any potential forms of multilateralism. Take also variations of minilateralism. That was a term I suspect was coined back there in the 2009 in an article, a very short article in the foreign policy in the US, right? But people haven't got that much attention to it. How minilateralism could work out, particularly when you have very urgent issues that need to be worked out quickly, right? And it doesn't have anything to do with avoiding structures like the UN, but you need to produce results in real time within particular geographies. We haven't given it too much of a chance, and look at the way that the G7 has evolved throughout the latest years, right? We got the G7, we got the G8, welcome Russia into. Eventually, we ended up with the G20. Why? Not to circumscribe the UN, but literally there have been urgent matters that would require urgent responses to that. So you need to create a global architecture that will make flexible global governance in real time if we want to stick discussing in terms of global governance. How about taking multilateralism as an organizing principle? So not as an end in itself, not as a process, because let's see, we are not that much interested into the dynamics. That would be too easy to deal with multilateralism, but as a principle to organize relations among states. I think some states are very happy to do that. Why not looking more at the great powers? Take this bluntly, as it has been so far. Let's look at the great powers' behaviors that may come back to some forms of multilateralism that they used to do some decades ago. The only difference that we will be getting now is that the globe, we would have the globe as the locus to produce multilateralism rather than just Europe. And some potential challenges ahead, and I conclude with that. We know that this has been quite a decline in the West, and I already mentioned on that, particularly given the US unilateralism, and you can pick up Afghanistan, Iraq, and all the like as being textbooks, literally, that you describe how aggressively we understood in the Western Hemisphere to use multilateralism, to use alliances to promote this sort of what you probably call primary institutions that have been produced, having a Western pedigree, having a Western definition. And that they sound also very familiar in town. There would be the rule of law, there would be the human rights. That for some geographies, they were not just right to absorb that, and they would give by far more primacy to some old traditional primary institutions that have gained traction throughout the latest couple of 400 centuries, like sovereignty, like non-interference into domestic affairs, like the double standard sovereignty, and so on. The EU seems to me to be trapped a bit and preoccupied into resisting against within rising multilateralism. So that's not outside the borders, but within the European Union, as various initiatives at the regional level. And the most popular one that some people may reference to is the Visegrad Group, and the latest one, the 3 Seas initiatives. That is blatantly torpedoing all the work that has been done at the supranational level. That we would build a bit of coherence in terms of foreign policy. That would give the EU a chance to gain in terms of activeness and promote whatever acquis we have in terms of multilateralism. So the EU is at the moment a bit shut doing its own, let's call it domestic affairs. And I will just conclude it here. Thank you.
Very interesting. Well, the questions will come afterwards. Now, I just give the floor to Mr. Istomin to continue the presentation on this debate.
Thank you so much. It is a great pleasure to be here and to participate in this important debate. I think I will follow Florin's lead on this subject and will not concentrate only purely on the UN, but will try to talk about the multilateralism in a kind of broader and maybe a bit of abstract perspective. But I think that the example that was given by you in the beginning of our debate is very representative, because when I saw the title of our debate, is multilateralism dead? I was thinking, and when it was alive. And precisely, perhaps the only period when it was working and operating properly, it was the late 1980s, the beginning of the 1990s. And this was under very specific conditions, structural conditions in the international system, when, frankly speaking, the Soviet Union was already weak, but the West hasn't realized it to the degree and was still eager to take its opinion into account. And then, of course, the situation was started to change further, and we come to the current situation. So I would like just to restrict my remarks to just 2 points, 2 remarks. And first, talk about the current situation, then back kind of a bit about the Russian position in the current situation. So I think that the most important development that we have in this decade, 2010s, is that what we see is the return of the great power politics and the great power competition, which was tamed to some degree in the previous decades. And we could see it on various levels. We could see it in the political rhetoric, we could see it in the kind of capabilities acquisition and the level of military spending rising, and we also could see it in the increased conflictual increased patterns of the local conflicts in specific areas where we see acting the major powers. So I think this is one of the developments that we are having, and just to give an example from this year, which from my perspective is very telling, we basically only just had a military standoff between India and China in Bhutan, which are the 2 major powers, and it is always dangerous. It is dangerous when you have proxy wars between them, but it has become even more dangerous when you have them directly confronting each other. And here maybe I have a bit contradictory view to what Professor BUZAN said previously, because I think to some extent we find ourselves in the worst of the possible worlds. Because on the one hand we have this great power competition rising, and at the same time we have very high level of economic interdependence, right? The globalization brought this interdependence, and it is very hard for the major powers to get back to their regions and to concentrate on some specific areas. They are reliant on the global economy, and they need to participate in the making of the global rules. And specifically what Florin said about the WTO, it's not that no one wants the WTO to talk, no one wants to talk around to finalize, but everyone wants to finalize it in their own way. And we see that as it is impossible, each starts to provide their own initiatives. The Chinese are very engaged in the regional comprehensive economic partnership in Asia. The United States had TTIP and TTP. Sorry, I had just after the flight yesterday, still recovering. So we have this this dynamic where and these are not regional projects per se. These are regional projects which are intended to create rules of the game for the whole world in international trade. So this is a kind of the situation which I think will remain for some time, and which will create kind of problems and conflicts for the global governance which we haven't had in previous years. And if there are any solutions to this, any structural solutions to this pessimistic picture which I just noted, I think that there are two ways how it could change on the structural level. The one structural level is the emergence of new technologies, which will make economies of states less dependent on the global chains of production and global finances. And now if you look at the economic literature, there are some talks about probability of less globalized economy as a result of new industrial developments and new developments in patterns of production. This is one way. And the second way is something that I think is related to what Professor BUZAN was saying. And if the states will become even more artistic in his representation. And why this could happen? I think this could happen due to another very important process that we experience, and not talking a lot when we talk about international relations, is the rising inequality on the national levels across the globe. So if we look at the global level, we see that there is less inequality across societies, between societies, but apart, I think, from the Latin America, in each and every region in the world, and certainly in all the major powers like China, like Russia, like the United States, we have an increased level of inequality in comparison which we faced several decades ago. Yeah. So the question is whether the states will concentrate primarily on dealing with this internal domestic social inequality, and then they don't have resources and time to engage in this competition. But these are the two kind of structural solutions that maybe could have. And finally, as I advertised, a few words about I think Russian position. I completely agree with Professor BUZAN that we cannot talk about Russia as a rising power, and it's better to talk about Russia as a restoring power. Because, frankly speaking, Russia was one of the two players who played a crucial role in the creation of the current global order during the Cold War, during the starting from 1945 and onwards, the UN system, and the current system of international law. However, in the 1990s and the 2000s, there were expectations, especially in the early 1990s in Russia, that there will be a new development where we'll create the joint new institutions together. One of the representations of it was perceived as the Organizations for Security and Cooperation in Europe. But instead, how Russians perceived it, the West chose another path, the United States chose another path, is to take the Western institutions, which operated well for the Euro-Atlantic community, and to decide they operated well for us, maybe they could work for the rest, and we could extend them. But this was something which Russia felt that it was excluded from it. So now Russia faces kind of a dilemma. On the one hand, it is the basic institutions which it favors because it was one of the participants of their creation. On the other hand, it has the layer of the institutions which were promoted by the West in the last 2 decades, which it says that it can perceive that it doesn't have a voice into this, that they were not inclusive enough. And then there is the third challenge, is the wave of the interest of the new rising powers, which will bring their demand for the new institutions, which would also be not always comprehensible to this basic level that Russia was helping to develop in the previous decades during the the bipolar world. So I think that Russia is trying to find its way in this trilateral system. We sometimes tend to think in very simplified bilateral oppositions. It's rising power, dominant power, status quo power, revanchist power, but sometimes we need these third categories, like the category of recovering power or restoring power, to understand the complexity of the attitude towards also the global order and towards the multilateral. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Super interesting. And now, Mr. Nitoiu will tell us which status Romania will have among those categories. Rising power.
Well, that's difficult. Well, thank you for having me here. I thought I would give a sort of different flavor to the discussion. I'll focus on the European Union, but also on Romania as well. I see what kind of position would the European Union have in this kind of changing world order that we've been discussing, but also what kind of opportunities does Romania have in this context. So I'm going to be quite pessimistic when it comes to the European Union, but surprisingly optimistic when it comes to Romania. So in terms of the European Union, my main point here is that we live now in this kind of post-Cold War period, which is dominated by the decline and disengagement of the United States. And the European Union seems not to be able and willing to actually adapt to this new world order. And the consequence of this is that we're going to see the European Union more and more sidelined and ignored from political issues on the international agenda. Nevertheless, as Barry said, the European Union will still remain an important trade and economic actor in the world. And we're also seeing the European Union losing a lot of legitimacy in international relations. The European Union has been quite, say, arrogant and also a bit pedagogical in its approach and trying always to preach to other states what they should do in order to achieve democracy, open economies, and all the rest. And this challenge is coming from outside the European Union, but also inside. Let's look at what's happening in Romania with all the pushback against the rule of law requirements coming from the European Union. So that being said, I think the challenges for the EU's global governance approach are coming, especially, well, on three dimensions. There are external challenges, internal challenges, but also in terms of identity. And the European Union's global governance approach was based on this idea of creating some sort of effective multilateralism based on principles, on some sort of equality, norms, values, the promotion of democracy, human rights, and all the rest. Now, this was very well, I think, suited for the post-World War period where the United States created some sort of Western hegemony or stability. But now, as I say, this is coming, there is very much pushback from other states in the world. On the external dimension, the European Union has now to come to grips with the rise in geopolitics. The European Union, for that matter, doesn't really have any sort of capabilities that would allow it to do that. For much of the last 30 years, it has focused on developing this kind of foreign policy based on the promotion of norms and trying to argue that it is a different kind of international actor that doesn't focus on a hard power and power politics in international relations. So in a more geopolitical world, the European Union will find it increasingly more difficult to become relevant. At the same time, other states like Russia or China or the BRIC states as a whole are coming up with new competing models of global governance which actually challenge what the European Union is doing. Think about the Eurasian Union or the series of banks that China is developing in Asia. All of these are competing models. Now, internally, we all know that the European Union is facing a lot of crises. And it has become very much inward now in terms of dealing with those crises, trying to come up with various solutions. In terms of foreign policy, there is still a lot of divisions. division, and member states are trying to deal with foreign policy issues, sometimes in very individual ways. And from the perspective of an united European foreign policy, this is causing a lot of problems. So in future, well, going forward, combined with the challenges coming from the external areas, the lack of unity and continued division, lack of coordination and coherence will still pose a lot of difficulties for the European Union trying to have a relevant voice in international relations. Now, in terms of identity, the best word to characterize the EU's identity in international relations now is confusion, because the European Union has for a long time ignored that geopolitics still dominates the foreign policy of other countries like China, Russia, the United States for that matter. But now, with the Ukraine crisis, with the Arab Spring, and with Russia becoming more and more assertive, it has had to wake up to this new reality. And the question is how to integrate a more pragmatic view in the EU's identity. Now, the European Union has engaged in the strategic review and came up with the global strategy last year, but for me, this is, at this point, it's just a piece of paper. It has not really been implemented in practice. Now, to go to my second point related to Romania, and I'm currently writing a book on Romania, so I've done a bit of research looking into some historical approaches to Romanian foreign policy, but also into the intellectual foundations of Romanian foreign policy throughout the centuries. And I'm going to focus again on the three dimensions, external, internal, and identity. And I would argue that Romania's foreign policy in its default state, in its natural state, would be more focused on what I call a sort of cosmopolitan geopolitics. That's a foreign policy based on seeking opportunities and taking advantage of them, having a sort of multi-vector approach, which is also influenced by what I call humanistic values, not liberal values. So these would be like dignity, avoiding, understanding diversity in international relations, having an openness for ideas, but not those Western, what we understand as mainstream Western liberal values. Now, in terms of the external challenges to the European Union, I think the opportunity for Romania comes here from, well, trying to go back to that kind of humanistic understanding of international relations and trying to maybe not copy, but be influenced a bit by what the BRICS countries are doing with this kind of policy of peaceful coexistence, of trying to be friends with everyone. And obviously this runs the risk, if you're trying to be friends with anyone, you might not be friends with no one at the end of the day. And the other main risk with this is that you might be the theater of conflict and competition between great powers if you don't play the game in the right way. But as I say, going back and trying to develop relations with other states rather than with the single pole we have a strategic relationship now might be something very useful. And to that extent, the period we've been experiencing in Romanian foreign policy now is an anomaly, because it goes against this kind of opportunistic multi-vector foreign policy. And it's a sort of monoculture foreign policy based on outsourcing what Romania does to other poles in the world and actually not doing anything at the end of the day and waiting for other great powers to choose what we do in international relations. Then in terms of...
Where is the optimistic point? I don't see it.
No, let me finish. So in terms of the internal aspects, there is a great deal of hypocrisy in EU foreign policy. So a lot of states are arguing that we should have a united foreign policy in Europe. But if we look at what states like Germany, for example, or Italy, or even the UK are doing, they're trying to strike bilateral relations with other great powers in the world, like Russia or China or Brazil. And to some extent, I mean, this is not that much obvious in the public sphere, but there are always pressures on smaller states like Romania, for example, like the Visegrad states, not to go and do the same kind of bilateral relationships, because there's not enough, well, pie for everyone. So if states like Germany want to have good trade relationships with China, obviously there's not going to be at the end of the day enough for everyone. So the task here is to try to build similar kinds of relationships, for example, with China, with Russia, with India, with Mexico. But the problem in the case of Romania would be that I don't think there is enough expertise, resource, or political willingness to do this. But I think there is the potential in the future to go ahead and do this. In terms of identity, I would say that the confusion in EU foreign policy when it comes to identity now actually plays into Romania's strength. Because once it became a member of the European Union, Romania never totally embraced this idea of being part of a normative power force for good. The only thing that it did is that, for example, when looking to Russia, it had this kind of arrogant approach that now we're part of the European Union, we're more civilized, we've become liberal overnight. Right? So I think going back to the roots of the intellectual ideas in Romanian foreign policy and feeding those to the European Union through various channels, that might help. So this would be one of my optimistic points, and I'll end on that.
For having got a romantic note in our last session. But it is very difficult to guess the Romanian foreign policy at this time. Yes, which are the main lines, and maybe we can discuss about that later on. But before that, let's have the last intervention. Mr. Florin will say a few words. Unfortunately, Mr. PṳN SînTOIU had to leave, and well, he asked me to ask apologies for his absence in the last part of our discussion. So, Mr. Florin.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Beyond the geopolitical dimension of the relations between the great powers who are handling the UN most significant issues, I invite you to take a look also at the resources available to this organization. The size of the organization, the way that they are collected, shared, and used can give us an idea about the magnitude, but also the efficiency of this institution. So first of all, concerning the resources used in conflicts, the United Nations organization currently has a modest role in the resolution of conflicts and in the battle of development, but a more visible involvement in the post-conflict situation. The peacekeeping actions realized under the Security Council umbrella are rather mediation operations than battle or fight interventions. The budget of these actions is less than 1% of the world military expenses. By want of permanent force and the supreme commandment, as stipulated in the Charter of the United Nations, the troops are made available by the state members. What does it mean? The most important contributors are the states from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and Nigeria. The absence of the United States, of the European Union, and NATO countries, of Russia, of China, or Japan from this list shows us that the UN is now an institution without the resources to prevent the major international conflicts, and as it was initially intended. In September this year, during the United Nations General Assembly, the United States, the most important UN financial contributor, announced cutting its contribution by $1.3 billion. And the Vice President, Mike Pence, defined a new policy in this area. Briefly, he said, when a mission is successful, we will have to fix a deadline. If we don't reach the objectives once, we'll need to reorganize the mission. And if we have several failures, we will have to put an end to that mission. This is the vision. With a budget of $7.8 billion and 15 missions, which don't seem to have an end, actually the United Nations will be obliged very soon to reduce its 95,000 operational headcount as today. But this change will be actually formal, because practically nobody believes that the blue hats will stop the crisis in Congo, for example, will disarm the different groups in Central Africa, or impose a peace agreement in Mali or in South Sudan. The reason here is simple. For more than 10 years, the United Nations has in conflicts resolution almost the same role as homeopathy has in cancer. More the peacekeeping structures are professionalized, more the missions lose their meaning actually. In Africa, the last UN peacekeeping success were at the beginning of this century. Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Burundi. In fact, according to very credible sources, the UN peacekeeping leaders have in their mind the idea that the organization missions are not supposed to solve conflicts, but to stabilize them. And defined by the Security Council as the protection of the civilian and the implementation of the state authority, this so-called stabilization mission is actually a loss of control on the battlefield side. Being considered as a priority, the civilian protection remains actually rather an illusion. And as long as the objective is not shared by the most significant blue hats country contributors, providers. Just a few examples, events where the UN were totally passive. In 2014 in Congo, where the blue hats actually tolerated massacres. In South Sudan in July 2016, when the blue hats refused an emergency request before strong violence. In Central Africa during a recent massacre. But why we are here? Why this very limited efficiency? First of all, because of the military incapacity. The peacekeeping missions don't have a real military force. I have spent 10 years of my life in the army, here in Romania and in France, and I know what an army is. And the 95,000 blue hats have all the military appearances. I mean the uniforms, the arms, the helicopters, the vehicles, and now the research drone, but they are not an army. Why? Because first of all, they don't have a unique commandment line. So they have at least two. On one side, we have the UN force commander of the mission. On the other side, we have the country which delivers the soldiers. Secondly, because using the force, or fighting, or taking the risk to fight, is sometimes totally excluded from the mission. This is very interesting. During the secret negotiation between the UN and some soldier contributors country, the perimeter of these countries are totally, let's say, reviewed in order to exclude the use of the force which is actually stipulated by the Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. This difference between the military appearance and the blue hat's reality is the source of the misunderstanding which exists between the UN and the local population, who don't really understand why thousands of people in uniform don't fight and don't use their military resources. This ambiguity makes it very difficult to argue that the important improvement source for the UN mission is the increase of the number of its soldiers. But why should we have more soldiers or military equipment and more budget if a secret agreement interdicts to use all of this? The second reason about this very limited efficiency of the United Nations military operation is the lack of strategy. In many cases, the peacekeeping missions don't have a simple strategy to solve the conflict. And they seem very often to represent an alternative to the political pressure, which is less convenient actually for them to be used by the international players for their country clients, let's say. And the best indicator for this lack of strategy is the mission mandate, which in more than roughly 80% of the situation is almost the same. Disarmament program, armed forces demobilization and reinsertion, security reforms and transformation, transition justice, and human rights. Irrespective of the conflicts, the actors, the countries, and the UN is promoting all the time the same peace model, let's say, the same peace template from Balkans to Mali. But the UN means are limited also within the other structures. I will give you just a very short series of data regarding the most important agencies' activities that depend on the United Nations organization. First of all, UNESCO, with the key mission to ensure a good level of education worldwide, to uphold the world heritage, the cultural diversity, the freedom of speech, and the freedom of media, has no means to carry out its objectives. Its early yearly budget stands at approximately $700 million, pretty much the cost of a few masterworks purchased at the auction house Christie's, for example. FAO, the UN Agency for Food and Agriculture, has a budget of under $1 billion to find solution for the 3 billion souls in its care. I mean the 3 billion persons who are very hungry in this world. Its actions are therefore rather symbolic. And the UN New York headquarters also is very interesting, built back in 1950, has serious decay and security issues, according to some very credible sources. The organization does not have the necessary funds to remedy these problems. So, ladies and gentlemen, as a conclusion, we have to recognize the United Nations don't have the resources to prevent or stop the conflicts. If they want to avoid a new world war, the current and also the rising powers should try to imagine what the humanity was not able to build during its entire history, a global governance system. To design a new global governance architecture requires a lot of imagination, realism, and of course, resources. I don't believe in a multipolar world, which in my opinion, sooner or later will be a new source of global conflict and chaos. I believe in the efficiency of a new concept of nations, which can be built by the powers being recognized as such. The United Nations must be transformed according to these evolutions, in my opinion, and remain a platform of dialogue, guarantee this new international order which emerges organically, actually, in front of us. Thank you very much.
It's a demonstration of a optimistic conclusion out of a very pessimistic data. Well, dear colleagues, well, Professor BUZAN, perhaps you would like to comment on those four presentations, and before asking our colleagues here if they have some questions or comments themselves.
Thank you. I don't think I will comment on them. Each of them contains their own kind of wisdom with which I don't particularly disagree, but I'd like to add a kind of broad perspective on the subject of multilateralism. It seems to me we have to appreciate multilateralism as one of the two big gifts that the United States has made to international relations. One was capitalism, global capitalism, as I said, and the other was multilateralism as a way of doing business. They got off to a bad start with the League of Nations, which is an American idea, but which they didn't take membership of, but made up for it in a sense after the Second World War by establishing multilateralism as the way of doing pretty much all of the business that was to be done in the international system. And I think this, I'm not worried about this institution because I think it's very deeply embedded and very durable, which isn't to say we don't have problems, some of which have been pointed out. And the US itself began moving away from its own invention in the 1990s and more so during the noughties under the Bush administration. And this, I think, was a very good indicator of America's decline as a superpower, that it abandoned one of its own big contributions. But if you think about this, this is now, I mean, really seriously deeply embedded in the way that international life occurs. It's particularly deeply embedded regionally. I mean, all regions have some kind of organization, and all of these organizations are multilateral, and they are not going away. They may change as the Organization of African States change into the AU and such like, and new ones may arise, but that's now a fixed feature of doing regional business. And it's also a fixed feature, I think, and a functional necessity indeed of thinking about the way in which those shared fate issues that I mentioned are indeed have to be handled. You cannot run a global economy without multilateral organizations of one sort or another. You can change those organizations, you can get fed up with them, you can have fights over them, but they've got to be there if you're going to run something as complicated as a global economy. The same is true for global health, for the global environment. All of those things have multilateral organizations in them. And if there aren't organizations, then there are multilateral conferences, like the Periodic Law of the Sea conferences, to put things into play. I don't think any of this is going away because we simply can't run the planet without it. And that, as I say, was a great American contribution. Its function might change in interesting ways. For those of you on the nerdier side of international relations, it's an interesting thought that global governance, which has generally been taken to involve non-state actors and small states and such like, and intergovernmental organizations, has been, in effect, merging with what the English school calls great power management, the idea that the great powers are a kind of managerial committees that are supposed to look after the broad interests of international society. If you take an example like, say, the Ebola crisis in 2014, what you have there is a really interesting mixture of things. Right? You have great power management going on. The United States and China in particular made significant contributions, including using their armed forces to help deal with the crisis. But that wasn't the only thing going on. the World Health Organization played an important legitimizing and coordinating role, even though it was criticized for being under-resourced and having a late start, etc., etc. And a variety of non-state actors like Médecins Sans Frontières and others got involved in actually dealing with things on the ground. And what was really interesting is that normally Médecins Sans Frontières would not work with a military organization. That's been one of their principles for a very long time and for very obvious reasons. But in this case, they were very happy to work with the Chinese military and with the American military. That, it seems to me, is an interesting pointer to the future of multilateralism. That, in a sense, these multilateral organizations will play coordinating and legitimating roles. They are not the instruments of global governance in and of themselves. They are part of a wider package. That said, I would agree that particularly the global level multilateral organizations are in trouble. I mean, I think I could make that rarest and perhaps stupidest of all things in international relations, which is to say a firm prediction. I would say that without any doubt at all, over the next decades, there's going to be a very long and probably quite irritable renegotiation of what the main multilateral organizations at the global level look like. Because this is going to be part of the transition out of the Western era. The West, and the US in particular, set up all these organizations, and they, naturally enough, set them up in their own interest, and with themselves in commanding positions within these organizations. The Chinese and Indians and other rising powers realize the necessity for having these organizations, but they don't like, as it were, being forced into framings which they did not themselves participate in the making of, and which put them in a disadvantaged position. So there's going to be a long struggle over what the global multilateral institutions look like. We can see the opening moves already. The American administration has been sufficiently stupid to convince the Japanese to go along with them, as not to join into the Chinese Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Because the Chinese are basically saying, all right, we don't want to give us our proper weight in the existing institutions. We'll set up our own. And that's what the BRICS are doing as well. So these things might become alternative institutions, they might become accompanying institutions, or they might become bargaining chips for reforming the existing institutions. That's a process which is going to go on for a long time, the next several decades. So it's not that the settled pattern that we've got is going to endure, but I have no doubt at all that the idea of multilateralism and the necessity of multilateral institutions will remain an important part of the way we do business in international relations.
Well, Woodrow Wilson had a fantastic role in redrawing the European order after the First World War. The second point in his 14 points was freedom of the seas. The last one was the creation of an international organization. Well, it was clear that after the war, during the war, and at the end of the war, the United States tried to open the markets, to open, to expand a liberal approach, and I think they succeeded somehow, but it was a very interesting debate in the Congress concerning the ratification of the organization, and then they stayed out of Europe. Perhaps this was one of the reasons why we had a Second World War. After the Second World War, well, we discussed about the UN, but we have to remember that an essential element were the three pillars of Bretton Woods. And they made clear interest of the United States to expand a certain model, economic model, essentially. It was interesting why the Americans again didn't ratify after the war the Charter of Havana for creating the International Trade Organization, because the World Trade Organization was created later on in a very difficult situation. It was only the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade GATT, which for years, even as a treaty, became a de facto organization and tried to organize international trade. So UN, in a way, was important, in my opinion, not only in dealing with the conflict with blue hats and all these kind of things, but also because it created a fantastic institution, which was the International Court of Justice. And this model developed, especially after 1990, in a fantastic way. There are now about 300 international jurisdictions. Almost every small organization, or even on the basis of some treaties, different international jurisdictions have been created. And I think, well, you were speaking about the Law of the Sea Convention. They have a special tribunal for the law of the sea. And you have a lot of this kind of jurisdictions, not, let's say, diplomatic formats like negotiations with offices, conciliation, whatever, which were very common after the First World War, but a lot of jurisdictions. And I think the model of the UN, in fact, this model was created with the League of Nations, but modernized after the Second World War. But so now, if we look to multilateralism with bad points and positive, negative points and positive points, I think that, there is a certain confidence in third-party resolution mechanisms, and
not the international court, because it was denied by China. From this point of view.
Well, I cannot speak on behalf of China, but I can speak on behalf of Romania.
Yeah,
He said,
you mentioned the international court is something which is raised, but China did not.
I will come back to that, but for a minute. But well, for Romania, we had a very interesting experience with the International Court from Hague, because we were.
It was a mistake, after all. It was a mistake.
It was a mistake? Yes, of course, because otherwise we might have taken 100% of the territory.
It is above.
It is above? No. I think it was
an international question to Ukraine. So indirectly, we recognize we do have a territorial problem with one of the Soviet Union inheritance. So from this point of view, it was not the right time.
I will let you to give us an alternative solution, but let me say that from my point of view. But after I finish the speech, I mean,
sorry,
perhaps it was not very clear that we speak one after the other. So from my point of view, after 40 years of disputes, it was very important for us to finalize a dispute which could not be solved bilaterally, because all the negotiations didn't reach a result, and a bilateral agreement might not have been ratified either by the Romanian Parliament or the Ukrainian Parliament. To have that kind of conflict with a neighbor was a very, in my opinion, a very unhappy situation. Anyway, through the Hague, through the International Court of Justice, we have got 80% of the territory in dispute, and anyway, this result has been accepted and had to be accepted also by Ukraine. So In my opinion, it was a good option and a good solution. Well, about China, of course, China tried to expand its jurisdiction, to create artificial islands, to use them as whatever, you know this. And, of course, well, the International Court of Justice didn't accept that, or mostly didn't accept that. And the Chinese are not very happy with that kind of approach. But this is one of the problems of a unipolar world, or the problem with some of the rising powers. International law is very important at a time when you don't have differences very strong differences in power. And you have seen that during the last 25 years, there were not many international treaties being signed. In a unipolar world, international law has no great achievements, because well, force is a temptation that a great power, a superpower might have. So I think it is interesting to see the UN also from this angle, with international jurisdiction being utilized, being very efficient lately. Now, your comments, please.
Everything multilateralism and new international orders, either as polycentric system or global governance, brings up the question of UN reform, briefly mentioned by Professor Nastase, and an idea pushed ahead by the United States. Of course, it is just normal to be concerned about the obsolescence of the UN founded in the aftermath of the Second World War. The UN does need to boost its activity in search for effective answers to the massive challenges of our time, particularly with regard to nuclear arms proliferation. But there is cause for cautious optimism about the US drafted 10-point declaration promoting reform of the organization. For one thing, another problem that has already been mentioned, the US Charter may well state the sovereign equality of states. Actually, there is a handful of influential states and a large majority of less influential or non-influential ones, a situation epitomized by the Security Council, whose 5 permanent members can veto any UN resolution. Historically, these permanent members used to be the victors of World War II, or at least the prospective victors of World War II, the United States, Great Britain, and Soviet Union. China was co-opted due to its huge population, so the demographic factor counted at the time, but also for political reasons. Each side hoping for the victory of one of the contenders in the ongoing Chinese Civil War. The United States and Great Britain counting on Chiang Kai-shek, and Soviet Union on the Communist Mao. In the end, China proved to be nobody's planned state and has been pursuing its own interests ever since. The fifth member, France, has been asked to join in less as a military power than as an ally, to side with the United States and Great Britain against Soviet Union. Nevertheless, up till now, these 5 leading powers, by using their veto to block unacceptable proposals for themselves, have managed to neutralize each other and strike a balance between conflicting interests. And this may be the major achievement of the UN. Now, with the shaping of a new polycentric world order, multipolar, expanding permanent membership in the Security Council can be a way to do justice to the world's present or emerging industrial powers, Germany, Japan, Brazil, and India. But it's also a political gambit, consistent with Washington's global strategy, a move towards fostering new alignments. It is all a question of alignments. Germany, as a leading EU member, will probably promote a European approach to UN reform, which is rather obscure at the moment. But Japan, that does not recognize its war crimes, and is experiencing an awakening, a revival of militarism, Japan will unavoidably side with the United States. Brazil is a major leader in Latin America, a zone that the United States are trying to maintain in their sphere of influence, in their close sphere of influence. India, again, a former Soviet Union ally that rejects to follow UN regulations, resolutions about the Kashmir territorial dispute with Pakistan. Well, India is being courted by the United States, not out of love, but as counterparty to China, to counterbalance China, that is a key competitor in the Asia-Pacific area. To sum up, the major alterations the United States intend to bring to the organization, expanding the number of the security members, of the Security Council permanent members, depriving the present permanent members of their veto rights, and enhancing the authority of one person, the Secretary General. Well, these alterations are unlikely to promote dialogue on the global political scene. Measures of this kind simply can't stimulate the solution, the solving of international security issues, not only because of the shortcomings of peacekeeping measures, but also because NATO, after having abandoned its defensive status, now competes against the UN for sorting out such problems, as mirrored, illustrated by the military interventions in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, all with long-lasting beneficial effects. Therefore, the United States reform proposal, if enforced, can truly mark a modernization of the organization, but it is more likely to trigger a destabilizing crisis with widespread disunity between major power blocs and disagreements even among members of the non-aligned movement, as geopolitical struggle will become harsher and more acute. And this is really a dire vision of the future. Thank you.
Okay, any other comments? Yes, yes, please.
Thank you for the very interesting presentations. I have a question, I think, for all of the panelists. I was wondering, what are the sources of power in this new international order, or these new international orders? And at the end of the day, who gets to negotiate the rules on which this new international order is based on? Thank you.
Thank you. Another question over there.
Thank you very much. Professor BUZAN, you talked about the post-West order and about the competition for markets mostly in this new international order. However, what the military competition what role would military competition play in this new world order? And if we talk about a post-West order, then should we expect of the appearance of the non-West military alliance, for instance, which would compete NATO, let's say? Or should we witness a return to a kind of world concert, which would emulate, let's say, 19th century European concert? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the last one.
Тебе вопросы за профессор Istomin. Здравствуйте. Two questions for you. One question. I'm very glad that you are here. One question. Russian people, for 1,000 years ago, has always fighting against Turks and Muslims. 300 years ago, he was under Tatar occupation. Until recently, he was always enemy of Turkey and Islam in general. How could you tell us this extraordinary alliance between Erdogan and President Putin? Second question, pretty provocative also. All intelligence specialist officers, philosophers, politicians are claiming that now, with the trend of Europe, or this real invasion you have of so-called immigrants, in fact, massive immigrants, in 2050, the balance of birth rate of Muslim population will overpass Christian birth. How will it be position of Russia on the future West Europe dominated by Muslim religion?
Okay, now let's have the final comments from our panelists. Who would like to start? Perhaps Mr. Istomin?
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting set of questions. And I think maybe I will start with the question about the resources and the rules of the game. I think this is very important question that is still under discussion, because there are basically two major types of resources that are in play. First are material ones, and the others are social capital. And the problem is that we don't have good measurement to address this. And this is, we were talking about IR theory, so that's a big challenge for the IR theory, I think, to be better in terms of the measuring this kind of resources. But on the other hand, of course, when we look at the material resources, there's also a bit challenging if we think about the technological transformations and disruptive technologies which affect the aspects of traditional power balances. And this is, for example, a big concern in Russia today, to what extent the new military disruptive technologies would upset such fundamental institutions of the current world order, fundamental for Russia, for example, strategic stability, right? Strategic stability based on the not very nice concept of mutual assured destruction, but which worked for decades. So I think that what you are saying about what kind of resources, in general, we know what kind of resources we are talking about when we're talking about power, but there is a huge discussion and debate to what extent this is applicable, and how we could measure it in the current situation, current circumstances. But I think at the same time we have a kind of broad consensus around this area, around this debate, and in other formats who we more or less mean when we talk about major powers, and who could become major powers and who is not in the pipeline, so to say. And regarding the questions on Russian-Turkey relations, I think even if we look historically at the Russian relations with Turkey, were often problematic, but not always. And we had different periods in our relations. But also, I'm not sure that international relations are always the hostages of history. And so today's relations, I wouldn't call it as a kind of full-fledged alliance. It's a kind of more allegiance. Turkey is I'm not specialist in Turkey, but from what I see, is in a complex situation, both on the regional level in terms of the conflicts that surround it, and also on the more strategic level, because it has complex relations with traditional major partners. So for Turkey, it's interesting to find new partners, and Russia is also interested to have more multilateral. And what you said about the changing demographical patterns in Europe. I think this is a major concern in Russia as well, the issues of the demographic development. And this is where Russian scholars are looking very much on the European developments, because we also have this change in terms of the different categories of population, and we also have a kind of migration flows, primarily from Central Asia. But I think we don't have a specific position how we will interact with Europe in 2050. We have still to settle some questions before that, as you know.
Yeah, thank you. I will say something to the first and third questions. The first one, your lecture on the UN system and its reform. I think what I want to say there is that the differentiation between sovereign equality as a broad legal principle and the idea that the great powers have some special rights and responsibilities is not unique to the United Nations and wasn't founded then. This was worked out during the 19th century when standing intergovernmental organizations first came onto the scene in the 1870s. And it became quite clear, these were all functional organizations, river management and navigation and those kind of stuff, and weights and measures, postal systems, telecommunication. It was very clear right from the start of these organizations that you could not simply have one state, one vote as the operating principle, because those without any resources would have all the votes, and those with the resources would refuse to obey the votes because they would have to pay for everything. And this was not just something that the great powers said. It was actually accepted in long negotiations. That this principle was eventually accepted by all, that if you wanted to have this kind of organization, you have to have this differentiation, that you cannot simply allow a majority of have-not votes to order around the minority of powers which have all the resources, because it's just not going to work. And that was understood and accepted. And I don't think that principle is going to change. As long as there remains a world, seems likely to be the case, in which there's going to be a significant distribution of power between the big powers and the little ones, and this principle of sovereign equality remains an important part of how it works, you will have the typical structure now almost universally in intergovernmental organizations, that you have some kind of general assembly in which everybody has a vote, and you have some kind of special council in which the major resource holders and the major power holders actually have a bigger say. And if you don't have that, it doesn't work. So that, I think you can count on that as a well-established principle of intergovernmental organizations that is not going to go away no matter what kind of other reforms happen. Because if you remove that principle, then you simply remove the functionality of these organizations, and there's no point in having them. The second point on your question about military competition. Well, how much science fiction have you read? Are you a follower of Dan Dewdney and Dark Skies? You could imagine all kinds of scenarios for this. Those who are obsessed with space stuff, and I follow them a bit, they will say that there's going to be huge military competitions for what they call the high frontier, because from there you can dominate everything. And if you're thinking that the world is one in which this kind of military competition will go on, then whoever gets there first and can dominate it will rule the world. So if you think like that, there might be a problem there, and that might be one aspect of military competition. I don't think so myself, but there are those who do. There's going to be a lot of military competition of the kind you're seeing currently in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, of the kind of swaggering, shoving and pushing, elbowing around, making sure that your rights are not ignored, but probably mainly short of interstate wars. The kind of stuff that's going on between Japan and China and the United States and China, you'll see a lot of that, I think, but at a fairly low level for the most part. you will see, I think, a very intense military competition to maintain the system of nuclear deterrence. I mean, there may be some of you out there who like the idea of nuclear disarmament. I think you're living in fantasy land if that's the case, and anyway, it's not going to happen, because it's that kind of residual terror of nuclear weapons that is the principal maintainer of world peace, in my view. And I think the behavior of the great powers will be such that they will all want to maintain some kind of basic, credible nuclear deterrence against others that they see as threats. So you see the operation of this at the moment, if you want to take a close look at how it works and how it's likely to work, in all of the rhetoric around the North Korean problem and the fact that Japan and the United States and South Korea are responding to it by enhancing their ballistic missile defenses, and the Chinese are going berserk because they're saying, yeah, but if you do that, then you have leverage on our rather minimal deterrent, and you might be able to shoot it all down. In other words, this is not just about North Korea, it's about the viability of China's nuclear deterrent. There will be lots and lots of sensitivity about that as new technologies come on stream, as ballistic missile defense becomes perhaps more possible. So that, I would suspect, is going to be a very lively ongoing area of military competition for the foreseeable future about maintaining credible nuclear deterrence.
Thank you. Florin?
Thank you very much. Just in a few words, concerning the first question related to resources. So I think the best way to have an idea about the resources is to take a look on the economic indicators of each country on one side, or each alliance on the other side. I mean, alliance, we can take a look on the NATO resources, we can take a look on Euro-Russia resources, on the Shanghai Club resources, and so on and so forth. So for the moment, we don't have shared resources for the emerging on the or current powers. The second issue concerning, let's see, the negotiation of the new international order. The status of power is not negotiated. When the United States became a power, they didn't negotiate, nor Russia when they came back. The only one negotiation appeared after a very significant conflict, and this creates actually a status quo. What we can hope in this moment is that the leaders of this world will be wise, smart enough in order to imagine a new architecture for the global governance. It's what I said before. And this means a lot of creativity, also determination, and a lot of responsibility. This is my last point. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Mr. Nitoiu, the last word.
Yes, I'll be very brief. So in terms of sources of power in international relations, I'll just focus on the European Union. The economic power and the cultural attraction will not go away anytime soon, but there are two sources of power which are usually ignored, right? And that's the role of Western universities, Western European universities. So just consider the amount of, well, children of Chinese leaders and businessmen who come to study in Western European universities, and in the end they do get socialized in European values and culture. And there's also the way in which the European Union has empowered small states in multilateral settings. Think about the way in which it has driven forward the agreement on climate change. But that being said, I'm not completely comfortable with the way in which the European Union is using particular trade agreements in order to pressure small states. And here, think about the situation in which Ukraine is because of this kind of development. So, yeah, I'll finish with this. Thank you very much.
Okay. colleagues, we had a very interesting discussion with, at the beginning, the rising powers, and the way, well, power is associated with various actors in international affairs. And secondly, we discussed about multilateralism, and we discovered that there are decreasing multilateral settings. You have small multilateral institutions, and you have larger multilateral institutions, and you have a global multilateral institution. Well, it's very difficult to make so many interests to work together in the UN now. At the beginning, the UN had around about 50 members. Now there are more than 200. At the beginning, the US used the General Assembly because they had the majority in the General Assembly. Countries from Eastern Europe were not being members yet. When the countries from Eastern Europe, from the socialist camp, joined the UN after 55, 56, whatever, and after the 60s, when the newcomers arrived from the decolonization process, the majority changed against the initial Western powers in the General Assembly. So if you look at the activity of the UN, you will see how the sensitive issues switched from the General Assembly to the Security Council at some time. And then the Security Council can offer the possibility of a negotiation between the great powers. And this was, at a certain moment, this functioned very well. Sometimes it functioned as well. But of course, once that you have a degree of competition which is higher, it is more difficult to have agreements on regional issues, on issues concerning the proxies and whatever. Well, I'm sure that we might continue with this debate for hours. It is in a way the core of well, the major subjects in international affairs. You can bring also subjects connected with foreign policy, with specific approaches in various countries, but I'm very glad that we made this exercise in English here at the European Foundation Titulescu. And I'm very proud that we have Professor BUZAN here with us, and we very much appreciated his lecture and his comments. But I was also very glad that we had also a representative from a Russian scholar representing Russian academic institution, and of course the other colleagues from Romania, or being part of European culture, or participating and being educated in also abroad. I think it is very important. Perhaps this comment was very important. You cannot talk like Jean-Claude Juncker about a Europe of values without having people educated cross over Europe. And I'm very glad that even if we are frustrated, because many Romanians are living even out, and some of them after being educated outside. We have a new generation of young people, of researchers, and also of people of great quality who might represent the next elite in Romania. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to make reforms, and I'm sure that you remember the wave of the people, the period in which some of the Romanians went abroad at the middle of the mid-19th century, and they have learned a lot. And also, after the First World War, it was also a new generation which tried to modernize the Romanian society. But now, with Romania inside the European Union, we have a very difficult exercise. And after 10 years, after we became a member, we discovered that we are in a completely different environment. And we can see that out of 27 countries, members of the Union, only in 15 of them, there is a positive attitude. The majority of the people have a positive attitude towards EU. In Romania is one of those 15, but there are 12 countries in which the majority considers that they have a negative attitude concerning the European Union. And this is due to the fact that and this is perhaps also connected with the way that in some of the latest elections in Europe, we had populistic movements winning in Austria recently. And well, there are a lot of reactions of this kind in the Visegrad countries. So for Romanians, expecting a lot from this kind of integration, it is frustrating to see that Great Britain, for instance, decided to leave. It is frustrating to see that Spain has a problem with one of its regions, or well, trying to separate. Well, instead of creating more unity and solidarity, European Union becomes more fragmented, and there are so many scenarios for the future. Well, we hope for the best, but it's not very easy to live with that. And especially since we have our own political disputes inside, not only connected with foreign policies, or not merely connected with foreign policy, but that's why the climate is complicated. And, I think it is all over Europe, and so it is all over the United States. The debates in the United States about the role of the United States in the world. It's also, we don't really understand which direction exists in the American foreign policy at this moment. Concerning Europe, concerning Russia, the relations with Russia, concerning the relations with the Middle East. The way, so all these kind of problems depend on the perception of the status of each of those powers, and that's why it is important to listen to experts like Professor BUZAN and also people from other countries, including, of course, from our neighborhood, from Russia. Also, we should expand perhaps our contacts with people from Hungary, from Bulgaria, Serbia. So next week we'll have a more relaxed activity. We'll have a book being launched here by Mr. Titulescu and a splendid piano concert, and that's why I invite you, those who will be in Bucharest, to attend. So thank you very much for being patient.